Miki, thank you for doing this. I really appreciate it. I'm with today Miki Huntington, who I've known for a while now. She was introduced to us by our Vice President, Melpo Merdakis. And I guess, Miki, you were with Melpo when you did your certification training to become a coach.
That's correct. And let me start by saying thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with you, George. And Melpo and I had the opportunity to meet and collaborate when we first began our life coach training, sometime, what was it, last year or the year before? So we've been connected for some time now.
Yeah. And in addition to Miki's background as a coach, she also spent 25 years serving our country and retired from the Army as a lieutenant colonel, and she flew Blackhawks. Miki also works, you're at a college right now, correct?
I am. So I served 25 years in the Army, as you said, and I currently teach at Minneapolis Community and Technical College, and I'm also community faculty at Metropolitan State University in St. Paul, Minnesota.
That's great. That's great. Well, again, thank you for your service, and thank you for that continued service with our young men and women in our country. Although I should say, knowing the way academia is pivoting, sometimes some of your students aren't probably all that young. Yeah.
You know, it's interesting that you point that out. We talk a lot in academia about quote unquote non-traditional students. Yeah. And I don't know that there's that distinction anymore. You know, we really have a variety of students from all walks of life, particularly in the community college space. So you're absolutely right about the shifting nature of our college students.
Yeah. And finally, in terms of introduction, when about 2 or 3 times a year, we have retreats for our staff, and probably, is it a year already that you did the retreat with us, or is it a little less than that?
I think it's probably around 6-7 months now, but it seems like just yesterday.
Yeah, so Miki came in and did a communications session with us, which was really, I thought, pretty powerful and rewarding. And so many of us have carried on I guess the power of 3, the power of when you speak, if you can use 3 topics or 3 issues that you want to cover with someone. And Miki will talk about that more, but it's been a real benefit to me personally, because it keeps me a little more focused, and I have a tendency to go off into Never Neverland when I'm having conversations with people. So it's a good disciplinary tool for me. So the reason this has happened, and the reason we've been doing these, is that we've been kind of counseling our clients and other nonprofits that we're communicating with about how best to connect with your constituents, and to get people to talk about how COVID-19 has impacted their lives. And it's certainly, there's some generational issues there. There's some regional issues, because back east, it's had a difficult impact, or a different impact in New York, New Jersey, Connecticut than it has in other parts of the country. But I think it's fair to say that the entire country has been affected. So let me check in with you. How you doing?
Well, let me start by saying thank you so much for asking. Really taking a moment to connect with whomever you are meeting with, talking with, to just check in and say, how are you doing? That's such an important part of how to frame and offer some context in a conversation. And I'm doing fine, all things considered. And I would ask you the same question, George. How are you doing? How's your team doing?
We're doing well. I've noticed that it's affected me, and I don't want to say I've stepped up, because that sounds awkward, but I find myself doing things that I wasn't that used to doing, and I'm candidly working more. I'm not traveling anymore, but I'm working more. I'm on conference calls or Zoom calls or WebEx calls, I don't know, 7-8 hours a day routinely. And I'm finding it not onerous at all. I'm finding there's a certain amount of joy that I'm connecting. And I've noticed how my staff has stepped up. Once a week, we get together on a Friday morning early, and we do a Zoom call, and we do a temperature check, and we talk about our clients, and we talk about things that are impacting us as people and also us as professionals. So that's been great. But you're doing this. You're reversing the roles on me. You're interviewing me, which you're very good at. So take that, and I'm glad you're doing well, certainly. But take that and speak to me a little bit about, your students, your colleagues. Have you observed how they have adapted to the situation?
Similar to what you mentioned about you and your team stepping up, something similar could be said of our students, my colleagues, our campus team, and the community as a whole. As you mentioned earlier, I work primarily in the higher education field, and overall, I think we've adapted fairly well. But that's not to say that there haven't been challenges either.
Right. I guess you are doing distance learning, distance teaching?
Right, and so that's one of the key sort of perceptions or misperceptions, if I may. When we pivoted to primarily online teaching and learning in the spring semester, it happened to be shortly after our spring break timeframe. So we had a little bit of time to shift and adjust. But for some folks, they think, oh, this is what online learning is about. Really, it's not. What most of the college campuses have shifted to after that timeframe of COVID-19 really spreading across our country is crisis-initiated remote alternate delivery modes. And so that's one of the misperceptions that we're really working hard in higher education to address, which is that response to COVID-19, as adaptable and as creative and as honestly impressive as it was across the board, that's not what traditional online education looks like. So we're having now to sort of restate that, re-clarify that for folks going forward.
What's your best guess or estimate as to what September is going to look like, late August, early September?
It's interesting. I've been reading about what different campuses and different systems are doing to try and respond or forecast as best as possible, not only summer session, but fall semester going forward. For my experience, our campus has shifted to majority online for the summer, for sure. For the fall, we're prioritizing online and what we call blended, which is limited seat time in the classroom, and then the rest of the materials done online for fall. There are some other campuses who've shifted completely online. There are others who've opted to try and do some literal temperature checks in-house, testing their students, staff, and faculty to try and keep things on campus as well. So I think there's a lot of flexibility and a lot of choice in terms of how individual campuses and systems are responding for fall semester.
I don't know if you caught it, but in 2 successive days on the Today program, they interviewed the president of Notre Dame, and they interviewed the president of Purdue. President of Purdue is a former governor of the state, and they had a very different take on it. I would say the president of Notre Dame was very bullish on getting the campus open, and didn't get into a lot of details as to how it's going to happen. He generally spoke about wearing masks, generally spoke about social distancing, but in the conversation with the president of Purdue, he was very, very specific about it not being one size fits all, that there would be some classes where there would be partitions between the students and the instructor or the professor, that there would be obviously distancing within the room, and that some of the students would have an option of doing classes from home. I was talking to, I think you may or may not remember that I'm on the board of a college in New Jersey, Ramapo, and I'm the immediate past chair there. And I did one of these chats, these executive chats with Dr. Peter Mercer. And he raised an interesting point that I haven't heard anybody talk about. And that is the campus experience is going to be so much more important to freshmen because they've never had it before. So if we can do something with freshmen so they get the chance to leave their home and come somewhere and be on a campus for the first time, it might be a way of looking at some of the challenges. So, and I don't know if you heard anything about that relative to what we're going to be faced with next year.
Sure. And I did read some of the news headlines this morning, and I don't recall specifically Notre Dame or Purdue. One or both are planning to sort of accelerate their fall semester with the idea that they would finish before Thanksgiving, thinking ahead or predicting that there's going to be another wave or another spike sometime in the wintertime, similar to the common flu. And the reality is that there's so much uncertainty and so many unknowns that all of us are doing the best that we can with the information that we have to plan as much as possible with some built-in flexibility to respond to needs. Given that your wife is a nurse, right? At our campus, the nursing program is one of the few that really requires that face-to-face, actual patient care, hands-on practice in order for students to complete certain courses. And so to make room for those courses that really need that face-to-face component, the rest of the courses that don't necessarily need it, we're shifting to fully online or blended to give those folks who need the hands-on that space, that extra social distancing space on campus to be able to accommodate them as well. So even on one college campus where I teach, we've got a multi-pronged approach to try and deal with the uncertainty and really the sort of unknowns that we're trying to work through.
Yeah, so one of the things that we did at Ramapo was we graduated our nursing students early. So they got their degree and their cap and gowns earlier than the other students did, so they could begin their training and maybe be impactful in the greater New York, New Jersey area. You had a lot to. So we talked about challenges, and I don't know. We're trying to get people to think about the two sides to the coin. What might be a silver lining as they observe the challenges they faced and they dealt with professionally, personally. How about any gifts that you've discovered, things that were a pleasant surprise?
Sure. So I would be remiss if I didn't sort of highlight the key challenge that I think we're facing, that our campuses are facing, and that really has to do with gaps in access to education. That's probably replicated across the broader community or broader society as a whole as well. But for students, it's everything from access to laptops and high-speed internet or lack thereof, to other broader issues like work-life challenges, whether they've lost a job, or healthcare issues, even something like the privilege and opportunity to work from home. We don't all have that opportunity to do that. So keeping that broader context in mind, right? The silver lining is definitely the opportunity to connect. You mentioned how many Zoom calls that you've been on, the opportunity and the ability to connect with folks. That has definitely been the silver lining. We're finding ways to connect and to be creative about doing so in ways that we may not have done previous to this pandemic. Everything from, sending snail mail using the US Postal Service to, I literally just celebrated my sister's graduation. She just graduated from NYU grad school this week, and we celebrated on Zoom. And so there are so many different opportunities for us to really connect, even though we're physically apart. That sense of connection in new and creative ways has definitely been the silver lining for me.
What was her degree in?
She was at the NYU Steinhardt School in food studies.
That's great. Yeah. And she also had a military background. She
did. She served in the Air Force for 20 years.
That's great. You worked with us on communication, and I think I can speak for the team that we all benefited. I don't know, how am I doing?
I think it's great, and I'm so excited to hear that you and your team have really embraced that power of three model.
Yeah.
I find it to be very helpful as well in my own thought process, and to just get organized before or even when I'm speaking with someone, to really organize those thoughts in that power of three concept. So
give the viewer just a kind of a snippet of that, why it's important and why it helps.
Certainly. And just kind of as a general overview, if you were to ask me a question and I just started talking and rambling on and on and on and on, number one, you don't have a clear expectation of where I'm going. Number two, I might forget what the question might be and go off on a tangent. And number three, it benefits both of us to have a clear framework, not only of what I'm going to say, but how long I'm going to be talking. So when I outline it, just like I did with 1, 2, and 3, it clarifies the expectation for the viewer that, okay, she's going to give 3 key points and I can follow along for that relatively short period of time. And it helps both of us stay on track about what we're really talking about.
And you know, one of the things that I kind of editorialized on that is that when you say it's 3, after the first one, they know, okay, there's going to be 2 and then 3. So I know there's not going to be a lot of this. So it kind of gets them, hopefully gets them to focus with you. So you're focusing on the way you're presenting and they're focusing on the way they're hearing it. Are there any thoughts about how communication needed to adjust during the pandemic, or you know, and we don't know exactly. We know it's gonna change. We don't know exactly when it's gonna end. Any thoughts about that?
I do, and let me just jump back real quick to the power of 3. In that, you know, we don't necessarily say I have 3 points to share, right? 3 is a rule of thumb, so I might have 2 points, 4 points. That's just kind of a rule of thumb.
Right.
In terms of communications going forward with this unknown of the pandemic's future, I think it's so much more important for us to be patient and be much more intentional in how we communicate. So let me address each one of those. So for patients, you'll notice that when we're talking on Zoom, that we might need to pause an extra second or two to allow the person on the other end of the screen to really digest that question before they respond, right? So we're not stepping on the other person and both of us talking at the same time. So
Right.
having that patience while we're engaging with one another, particularly on a virtual platform, is absolutely critical. The other side of the other piece about patience is just having that extra dose of grace. There's going to be tech issues. There are going to be times where connectivity is a challenge. There's going to be times where time differences might cause a miscommunication. So just exercising that little bit of extra grace with one another and that patience is really going to be critical going forward.
Yeah.
The other piece too is, I think, preparedness, right? And really making sure that we're making the most of this time together. When we're on Zoom calls for 7, 8, 9 hours, right? We want to make sure that we're making the most of that time that we have together. So each of us taking that time to prepare and be fully present, which is my third point, is really key in making the most of that opportunity. And being present, I mean truly being present. So not multitasking, not, you know, thinking about 3 meetings ago that you just had on Zoom, but really fully being engaged, being present, and really making, once again, the most of the conversation and connection.
So my takeaway is patient, be patient, show a level of grace, and that can be tied into patience, prepare, and then be present.
Right.
Did I get that?
Absolutely, absolutely. So patience, preparedness, and
Being present.
present, exactly. So I use the P alliteration to emphasize that point of the power of 3, right? So if that happens to fit in with your concept, that's another way to really emphasize a point and to have it stick as a message that resonates even beyond the present conversation.
Yeah. You know, I was thinking a bit about my conversation with you, and thinking about your military background and the whole issue of leadership. No one gets to a point that you got to without understanding leadership. On a number of these executive chats, I spoke about a podcast that I listened to by John Meacham, and he talks about Winston Churchill, and he talks about how there could be a case one could make that if any other person who walked the earth, maybe with the exception of Christ, if you want to put him in the mix, that Winston Churchill was the most impactful person that ever walked on earth because of the convergence of him becoming prime minister and the beginning of World War II, and the things he did to marshal the resources of America. So it was the need, the man, and those two things coalesced. And and you know, I think most people would agree that when leaders reach a certain level of prominence, there usually had to be a situation that they addressed that got them to that level of prominence. Another thing I heard, and then I want to hear what you have to say, I'm conscious of the time, is that John Kennedy talked about right after the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he did what he did with the blockade, and it worked. He said, if I died today, I would go down as one of the great presidents, not knowing that soon after that, his life came to an end. But he understood how the situation and his, fortuitous decisions kind of worked, and nobody was sure they were going to work. So talk to me about that in your background and.
So I think leadership in the time of uncertainty is such a fascinating case study, right? It's one of those things where we're doing it now, but 10 years from now, 5 years from now, we're really going to look back and reflect on who really stepped up, right? Who really exercised exemplary leadership during this time of uncertainty. And I have few thoughts about this, some of it relates to the military. The first one is to really just simply lead, right? And folks will say, well, I'm not a leader. I don't have this title or this position or what have you. But whether by opportunity, circumstance, whatever it is, every single one of us, I think, has a role to play as a leader. So the question is really about how do you lead, or how effectively do you lead? So my initial response, particularly in a crisis, is to lead and respond to the challenges, not just simply react, but really respond to those crises, situations in an intentional, thoughtful, coherent way. So step number one is to simply lead. Number two is to be decisive, especially in the time of unknowns and miscommunication and misinformation. It can be especially challenging to make a decision. But one of the phrases that I continue to remind myself from the military is the 80% solution on time is better than 100% solution too late. So gather up that information that you have, right? Talk to the subject matter experts, whatever you need to do, but make that decision in a timely manner. That is so absolutely critical. And then the third and most important piece is to communicate that decision, communicate that vision, lead in a way that motivates and shows the people on your team who are with you, hey, this is the direction that we're going. If we need to adjust, if we need to make a new decision, fine, absolutely, that's great. But I think it's critical to do those three things: lead, decide, and then to communicate that vision clearly. Those are all principles that I learned while I served in the military, for sure.
That's really helpful. One of the things that we've been comparing the leadership styles of our political leaders, and I certainly don't want this to be in any way a partisan discussion, but I will talk about our governor in New York, and he's been very direct and giving people both good and bad news clearly, and I guess I'm prejudiced. Being in New York, I grew up in New York, that I was very satisfied and proud the way the New Yorkers and people in New Jersey really did adhere to the requests of their governments and acted in a responsible way that probably, even though we lost many individuals, they probably saved many individuals because of what they did. So getting back to what you were talking about, lead, be decisive, and communicate, where does information fall into that? The providing information.
Sure, and that's such an interesting point. I was listening to the radio yesterday, and they were talking about something that Governor Cuomo said, and I wish I had the exact quote, but it had to do with the tragedy of the death rate among seniors in senior living communities. And something that Governor Cuomo said was something to the effect of, they're older, they're going to die. And it's the comparison they were making in the radio show was how differently that information was conveyed by Governor Cuomo saying those words versus if somebody else were to say the exact same words. So as a leader, it's not just how you communicate the information in terms of what the words are, but that overall leadership presence. He's built that level of trust with his community. So no matter what he says, right, folks are willing to listen to that information because he's taken the time to cultivate that trust within his state, within that community. And so it's not just information, it's how you convey it and the relationship with the people that you're conveying that information to that is so important to cultivate and to continue to not take for granted, but to continue to hone and to continue to nurture so that you're strengthening that relationship even in the time of crisis.
So I'm reminded of our retreat where you spoke to us, I don't know, for 7 hours straight, I think it was, and how enjoyable it was. And I always enjoy spending time with you. I always enjoy speaking with you. I look forward to an opportunity to see you face to face one of these days. And I just want to thank you again, Miki, for doing this with us. And I wish you. I want you to be safe and sane and be well.
Well, that's very kind of you to say. And honestly, I enjoyed so much being with you and your team. And I hope my enjoyment of being there translated to hopefully a positive experience for you and everyone who was present during that workshop as well. It was an honor to serve your organization. And likewise, I wish you all the best. Please do take care and be well.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.